A very good evening. A federal appeals court then has ruled that Donald Trump can be prosecuted for his attempts to overturn the 2020 US election. A unanimous decision by a 3-judge panel marks a watershed moment in the prosecution and sets up a likely trial date sometime in late spring or early summer. Trump's lawyers had argued in court that a president of the United States must have full immunity, without which they said it would be impossible for him or her to properly function. But the court disagreed. Former President Trump's alleged efforts to remain in power, despite losing the 2020 election, they wrote, were, if proven, an unprecedented assault on the structure of our government. They went on. Allegedly, he injected himself into a process in which the president has no role. On immunity, they ruled that Trump's argument would collapse our system of separated powers by placing the president beyond the reach of all 3 branches. We cannot accept, they add, that the office of the presidency places its former occupants above the law for all time thereafter. We'll get the thoughts of our panel shortly, but let's bring in former federal prosecutor Joe Moreno. Are you surprised by what you read in this judgment, Joe?
Hey, Christian. No, not at all. And I think it's amusing that our country has functioned for 200 years with presidents who have operated just fine without the blanket criminal immunity that Donald Trump now says is so necessary. But no, I think if you ask most legal analysts in decades now, I think most of us would have said a president cannot be prosecuted by his own Justice Department while in office. But as the D.C. Circuit referenced, once a president is citizen Trump or whomever, it's fair game. And this idea that this criminal blanket immunity would not only apply in office but continue forever is sort of nonsensical. So no, not a surprise at all.
But it's as relevant to a president in office as out of office, is it, Joe? I mean, you couldn't have, for instance, a president selling secrets to the Russians or killing his nearest political opponent.
No, for sure. I mean, the difficulty comes now, if a president is doing those things while in office, it's difficult to imagine that he or she would allow his own Justice Department to prosecute him. That's where Congress would step in with the impeachment power and say, okay, there is a high crime or misdemeanor under the Constitution. Let's impeach by the House, remove by vote of the Senate, and then, when the person is a citizen, can be prosecuted. The other way is to wait for the person to be out of office, then prosecute him. And so that's what's happened here. And while the Supreme Court in 1982 recognized a limited immunity from civil liability for presidents, I don't think anyone has contemplated that that would extend to actual crimes committed while in office.
Leanne Caldwell, how does this fit the election timetable? Let's say that the Supreme Court decides not to take it up, and Joe might have a thought on that, but if they don't, can the trial continue? Could it get to a conclusion before the November election?
I'm not sure about the conclusion, the timeline of the conclusion, but that means that the trial could start. The trial by the special counsel, by the Department of Justice, was just removed from the docket. That was supposed to start March 4th, and then they were waiting on a ruling on this issue specifically. So perhaps if the Supreme Court doesn't take this up, then that means that the trial can move forward much more quickly. But it is definitely not out of the question that this could be wrapped up before the election. And that's absolutely what most Americans would like, is an answer on if Trump is convicted before voters head to the polls in November.
Lord Darrick, this ruling would be familiar to most Western democracies. Indeed, the French have prosecuted their former presidents. The only countries where it doesn't tend to apply is in autocracies. And I wonder what you make of the arguments former President Trump, put into court.
I think, as has just been said, it is nonsensical, ridiculous to imagine that when you have left office, you are somehow immune from criminal prosecution for the rest of time, just whatever it is that you've done. So the outcome is no surprise. And there are 2 angles to this, Christian. One is, was he going to get off through this move, which was never likely? 2, I imagine this is all part of a delaying game that's trying to kick all of this beyond the election. And I'm not enough legal expert to know what his chances are on that. He has 4 cases against him. Whether he can keep appealing and kick them all beyond the election, I'd be fascinated to know. But the idea that that you have a former president basically playing these legal games so that he can run for office again, and then if he wins, somehow with one bound he might be free, is also an idea that would strike most of us in other Western democracies. Pretty odd, really.
Well, the unanimity in the court suggests that they saw through it as well. Let me just show you some quick new polling, Joe. This is from CNN, which was out today. It suggests the majority want a trial verdict in this election subversion case before they vote in November. 48% yes, it is. 48% said yes, it is essential. 16% said yes, but not essential. So a majority there. Regarding the efforts he went to in order to allegedly subvert the election, 45% believe the president's efforts were illegal. 32% say it was unethical but not illegal. 23% say he did nothing wrong at all. If you look deeper into that poll, Joe, there's not a lot of trust out there on all sides for the Supreme Court, but I think they will be conscious that with people going to the polls and this outstanding, they need to make a decision quickly as to whether they're going to hear it.
That's right, Christian. My understanding is that Trump only has until February 12th to seek an emergency stay from the Supreme Court. And at that point, the court will decide in a few weeks whether or not to take the case. If they do, it will be months from now, and it will definitely prevent the trial from moving forward. The trial is stopped in its tracks while the case moves through the appellate process. And so as we get closer to the election, the question then comes up, does the Justice Department want to move forward with a trial so close to an election? It can. There's nothing that stops it. However, longtime policy has been that the closer you get to an election, the preference is to avoid having a trial because it appears you're interfering with politics. Now, so far, Jack Smith and Judge Chutkan in this case are fully eager to move forward. But again, if this gets a 4, 5, 6 month delay as it works through the Supreme Court, even if the court does say, okay, there's no immunity, the trial goes forward, I'm skeptical that it happens before this year's election.
Just very quickly before we move on, in your mind, this could go back to court, to the trial court, and could proceed, jury selection, etc., if and when the Supreme Court decide they're going to hear it, or would everything just pause?
Well, everything pauses now while the Supreme Court at least considers it. If they don't take the case, it goes on right now as scheduled.
Okay. Before you go, we have a verdict. We've had a verdict in the past few hours in Michigan. This mother of a teenager who fatally shot 4 classmates at a high school near Detroit. She was found guilty of manslaughter. The prosecutors had argued she bore responsibility because she and her husband had given their son a gun and then had ignored the warning signs that within his behaviour, some mental health issues there. So it would seem, Joe, as I was saying to our correspondent in the last hour, that you can be held in law responsible for bad parenting. What sort of precedent does that set?
Well, it's fascinating because basically it's saying there's derivative liability, that even if you did not actually pull the trigger, if you will, in some kind of crime, if you helped facilitate it, in this case, providing a weapon to someone who should not have had it, or frankly, no child should have a weapon like that, then you have some culpability there. And so I think that gun owners and parents should take this very seriously. I think it's a good precedent. I think it forces people to be that much more responsible, and I hope it's taken seriously, frankly.
It's really interestingly